From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump plans to move ahead tomorrow with 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10% on China, and says tariffs on steel, aluminum, oil, chips, and pharma are all coming. We'll discuss the impact and how it affects the debate around tax cuts with Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum.
The FAA shuts down the helicopter corridor involved in the fatal mid-air collision of a commercial airliner and a Black Hawk helicopter. We'll have the latest from Washington with insights from House Transportation Committee Chair Sam Graves and Kristy Kiernan from the College of Aviation.
Donald Trump meeting today with Nvidia's Jensen Huang at the White House as the president signs another batch of executive orders. We'll have analysis ahead from our signature political panel. Thanks for being with us on the late edition of Balance of Power this Friday on Bloomberg TV and radio. We begin with news from the White House on tariffs, at last confirming what the markets have been waiting to hear, with major business implications around the globe. President Trump announcing tariffs starting tomorrow, as we mentioned, on Canada, Mexico, and China. Here's the president from just moments ago.
President, is there anything China, Canada, and Mexico can do tonight to forestall your implementation of tariffs tomorrow?
No, nothing. Not right now, no.
Not a negotiating tool?
No, it's not. No, it's a pure economic. We have big deficits with, as you know, with all three of them.
Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Gregory Korte at the table with us here in Washington. Gregory, there's been talk today of potential off-ramps, that this might just be the beginning, and if certain conditions are met, even though the president says they take effect tomorrow, that in the days and weeks ahead, some of these could be clawed back. Is that what we expect?
Remember, it was just last weekend that we had what we're calling the shortest trade war in history with these tariffs against Colombia for refusing to take back some migrants who had come to the U.S., and that was all resolved within the span of 24 hours. If you take the president at his word just now, there is no off-ramp, at least from now until tomorrow when he makes these tariffs official. He says he's serious. Wall Street has questioned his seriousness all along here. We expected tariffs to come on day one. They didn't. They were going to come then on February 1st, maybe later. Now it seems like he's sticking to the February 1st date, but also with threats to expand them further along in a couple of weeks.
Well, yeah, February 18th, he said oil and aluminum tariffs, for example, could go into effect. If we're talking most commodities here, tariffs on our three largest trading partners, threatening tariffs on Europe as well. Gregory, what's going to be left? Well,
yeah, if you take just the tariffs that he's going to do tomorrow with the three largest trading partners, that's somewhere 40 to 50% of all trade, right? If they are across the board with no exclusions. And Trump has carved out some industries in the past from his tariffs, so that is possible. But then, as you say, if we add these broad sectoral tariffs on commodities, if you add the European Union, which he's had his eye on, he has said from the beginning that he feels the European Union is even more unfair than some of these other trading partners. Yeah, we're getting into a lot of goods. And these are, Mexico, for example, is a major source of vegetables, tomatoes, avocados. Your Super Bowl guacamole could cost more this year with these tariffs in place. And, of course, Canada is a major trading partner for many commodities and auto parts, as we know. A typical car, the parts in that car will cross the Detroit River 7 times before they're assembled into a car. The cumulative effect of a 25% tariff could be really detrimental to a lot of makes and models of cars that Americans drive.
All right, Bloomberg's Gregory Korte with a great roundup for us. Thank you so much. And we want to get more insight on the potential impact now and turn to Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. Welcome back to Balance of Power, Douglas. When we consider the president's decision-making here around tariffs, he, in these remarks at the White House, suggested that this will not be inflationary. When we look at the sum total of what he says he's going ahead with here, what's your assessment of that?
Well, it's hard to accept that bottom line. I mean, if you think of just oil, Canada is an enormously important source of refinery fuel in the United States. You put a 25% tariff on Canadian oil, you're looking at 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. People will notice that. And, if he goes further to impose tariffs on all oil imports later in the month, then we're going to see a big impact on oil as a feedstock to all sorts of manufacturing, oil as an input into gasoline, and that's just been historically a recipe for inflationary pressures. More broadly, the things that have been so painful to the American consumer have been food and energy. And as the reporter mentioned, we get a lot of vegetables from Mexico. We have an enormous exposure there. So I don't see any real way that you levy these kinds of taxes. And these are big taxes. This is on the order of something that looks like $500 billion over 10 years, and not expect to have some economic impact. That's just the sort of straight-on impact effect of the U.S. announcement that we heard this afternoon. Remember, Canada has been preparing to retaliate and has prepared 2 levels of retaliation and could do that as quickly as these are being implemented. Mexico has promised the same kinds of retaliation, not as firm on their planning. But if you start moving a car back and forth across both the Mexican and the Canadian border and getting tariffs from both countries in the process, that's a really big impact on all the economies. And so this is a far from unimportant move by the president.
Yeah, unless, of course, they're not going to be around for that long, Douglas. And I wonder your thoughts on reporting in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the White House considering several off-ramps, that this is where you start. Yeah. And then maybe you take some things off as conditions are met. We heard earlier from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talked about the tariffs here during a meeting of the Council of U.S.-Canada Relations. Here was his take.
Right now, we're showing the new American administration that they have a strong partner in Canada when it comes to upholding border security, all while simultaneously underscoring that we won't back down, that if tariffs are implemented against Canada, we will respond. We won't relent until tariffs are removed, and of course, everything is on the table.
So what moves Donald Trump in this case? Is it action on fentanyl or immigration, or is it in fact dollar-for-dollar matching of these tariffs?
It's far from obvious, but we spent the day at the American Action Forum trying to track exactly what the president was going to do, and the rumors flew fast and furious. So there have obviously been a lot of discussions between the Americans and the Canadians and Mexicans within the White House and the administration. Various leaks come out in the various news sources. They get disavowed. That suggests to me that they are toying with lots of potential off-ramps, that there have been a lot of proposals that the staff supported, didn't get supported by the president, and we'll see how this plays out over time. Certainly, the president has mentioned 2 things on a regular basis, and historically, what the candidate Donald Trump says, he does as president. When he repeats something a lot, you should listen to the character of it at a minimum. Number 1 has been he cares a lot about autos, and he wants to move auto production back to the U.S. from both Mexico and Canada. So look for something on that border crossing 6, 7, 8 times to get changed in this negotiation. And the second is better border controls, both on the northern and the southern border, for both people and drugs, fentanyl in particular. Those seem to be the key sticking points for the negotiations.
Well, then you add on the aspect that he wants lower taxes, Douglas, and he has also argued that tariffs are not just about balancing trade relationships more in a way he sees favorable. It's about putting more revenue in the Treasury's coffers. What actual dollar figures would we be looking like here that, say, an external revenue service, if that's going to be created, is going to be able to collect?
Well, I mean, I say this lovingly, but he's wrong on both fronts. This is not going to balance bilateral trade deficits. That's never been an effective strategy. It didn't work with China back in 2018. It's not going to work this time either. Not with China, not with Mexico, not with Canada. The trade deficit situation is a broader macroeconomic phenomenon. They'll have a different strategy if they want to deal with that. And tariffs had never been a broad-based revenue source. At the peak, in the McKinley area that he's so fond of mentioning, we're in single digits, low single digits as a fraction of GDP. The federal government's spending well over 20% of GDP right now. There is no way in any feasible scenario that tariffs will be the broad-based revenue source that finances that kind of expenditure. And, we've heard a lot of talk about DOGE and controls on spending. We're not going to move that south of 18% down to something like 12 or a feasible number. So put aside any notion of trade balance, put aside any notion that this is the budget balance. This is a strategy to be viewed as an international economic policy with some international economic relations mixed in. That's the right way to think about it. The others are misleading.
Well, I'm not trying to get you off the Christmas card list here, Douglas, but the fact is this entire legislative effort is about to... I'm okay. Well, let's talk honestly here then. They're about to run into something called the CBO, which you used to run. And when these bills are scored, it may not tell a great story. And we're going to hear about how this is an agency that is partisan, that is inaccurate, and does not embrace dynamic scoring. What do our viewers and listeners need to know about this event that's about to take place?
Well, number one, the things that the White House does, these tariffs, other actions that the executive can take, have nothing to do with the scoring of those pieces of legislation. They don't count toward it or subtract from it. So they're going to try to mix and match, put that aside. Believe the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxation that score tax legislation are going to give a nonpartisan best answer that they can. That will likely disappoint the partisans, in this case Republicans, who want tax cuts to be very, very cheap and spending cuts to be extremely deep. And they've disappointed Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to disappoint Republicans in this case. That's par for the course. Know that if they get more aggressive, the CBO and the Joint Committee will get it right, and they'll show bigger deficits, not smaller. So you might not get the exact number that you would get if you had 20/20 hindsight, but it's going to be a good faith effort that guides the policy.
Mm-hmm. Douglas, it's great to have you back. Douglas Holtz-Eakin is president of the American Action Forum. Now that we have some real news to react to, it's good to talk with you, as always, on Bloomberg. Coming up, we'll take a look at what's next in the investigation of the fatal crash at Reagan National Airport here in Washington. Republican Congressman Sam Graves of Missouri joins. He's chair of the Transportation Committee. His unique view is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. The NTSB will be providing an update on the investigation of the fatal collision that took place at Reagan National Airport. We expect that a bit later this hour. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, we have a live view of the Potomac River at the airport where rescue crews, recovery crews, I should say, continue their work, with the chief of EMS and fire in Washington, D.C. earlier telling reporters it is still their mission to retrieve all of the remains from the aircraft and the chopper. Joining us now for more on this is Republican Congressman Sam Graves of Missouri. He's chair of the Transportation Committee, which gives him unique perspective on what's happening here. And Mr. Chairman, I want to welcome you to Bloomberg TV and radio. We understand 2 of the 3 runways have been closed and will remain that way to allow the recovery workers to do their work. We also know that a low-altitude corridor used by helicopters, and in this case the Black Hawk that was involved in this collision, have been shut down by the FAA. Will that be a permanent closure, Mr. Chairman, or is that just for the duration of this investigation?
It's hard to tell. It will be at least, I think, for the duration of the investigation. They've closed quarter 1, 4, and 6 are the ones that have been closed so far. And it's something we're going to take a look at. But I got to tell you, we see flights up and down those corridors dozens and dozens of times every single day.
Sure do.
And it's gone on for decades. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and certainly that has been noted by both the Secretary of Defense of the Transportation Department, Sean Duffy, as well as the president himself, Mr. Chairman. But we've heard a lot of suggestions as to what exactly caused this crash from those individuals, from the president specifically, who is associating it with things like DEI at the FAA. Given where the investigation is right now, is that responsible? Are these conclusions supported by evidence, to your knowledge?
It's hard to make and draw any conclusions at this point until the NTSB finishes their investigation. We'll have a preliminary report within 30 days, and then they'll give their final report, which will take a little bit longer. But it really hurts to speculate this early on when we don't even have all the data. They have recovered the 2 flight recorders from the airline, and they're still working to recover the flight recorder from the helicopter. At least last I knew, I don't think they had recovered it yet. But we're going to need all of those items too to help with this, to help with the investigation. But it's really hard to to speculate at this point whether or not it was, was it pilot error on the helicopter's fault? Was it air traffic control error? It's just hard to say, at least at this point.
Well, in a world of speculation that we are clearly living in here, Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of your answer, I wonder if you plan to help illuminate all of us through way of a congressional investigation. Will your committee be involved in an investigation into this crash?
We absolutely will. What's interesting is there will probably be some armed services jurisdiction as well, since it involved an Army helicopter. They'll probably be taking a look at it, which I'm on that committee as well. And then my committee will definitely be taking a look at this once we get more data and more information. I have my own personal opinions on what happened, but I warn people, let's not speculate until we have all of the information. And the NTSB is a very professional organization, and they don't put anything out unless it's factual. So, we tend to want to keep it that way.
Well, certainly. And as Joe mentioned, we are expecting a briefing from the NTSB just minutes from now at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. Mr. Chairman, when we consider DCA and the DC airspace, which, as we've all had much discussion about in the last few days, is incredibly congested, other than closing that helicopter corridor, is there anything else that you might recommend that can help avoid these kind of problems in the future to help deal with the congestion problem?
I'm not so worried about the congestion, to be honest with you. And I've heard some people speculate that when we added slots, that created more of a problem, which it didn't. It didn't have any impact on this whatsoever. In fact, there's more room for flights in and out of DCA if we were ever to move in that direction. The helicopter flights back and forth, and of course, this was a training mission. They also move. They move personnel back and forth from the Pentagon across the city. They just do a lot. There's always helicopters flying up and down the Anacostia and the Potomac, but they're supposed to stay below 200 feet. So there's a hard ceiling there. And for whatever reason, it's looking like that the helicopter busted that hard ceiling, and obviously was in the flight path of the airline coming in. Of course, they were on glide slope. They were cleared to land. The pilots inside that aircraft would have been watching very carefully their touchdown point and the runway itself. They would not have been looking outside the aircraft, and they assume once they're cleared in that the airspace is clear.
Well, our viewers and listeners should know, Congressman, that you too are a pilot yourself, and you know what it's like to land an airplane in an environment like this. I just wonder, with that said, knowing that you have interfaced on a regular basis with the professionals in the air traffic control towers at our airports, if you have ever seen a lack of professionalism, a lack of competence that could have been prompted by DEI hiring, as the president has suggested.
It's hard to tell. There's been situations, obviously, and I think every pilot, runs into these, where there's sometimes, some non-standard verbiage that's used, or some things that you kind of question here and there. You can't really point a finger at what the cause is. Having said that, I have always been concerned for at least 4 years now, the DEI hiring throughout the government, not just in the FAA and in transportation, but throughout the government. It's been a concern of mine for some time. Now, I'm not saying that this has anything to do with with this crash or the accident itself, but it's been a concern. It's a concern of a lot of members.
Well, you have less than a minute left, sir, but when we consider just the personnel questions at air traffic control, as well as our real problem here, the ability to get qualified people trained in an expeditious manner to get them in these jobs?
It is. And this is a highly technical, highly skilled profession. And we need the best people we can possibly get, doing the job. We need people that are able to stay calm in very tense situations and very tense environments. Some airspace is a lot more congested than other airspace, but we need the best people we can get. We don't need to be hiring people just based on the color of their skin or their gender or whatever the case may be. We need the best that test the highest on those aptitudes.
All right, Republican Congressman Sam Graves of Missouri, chair of the House Transportation Committee, thank you for joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Earlier today, Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine, sat down with Republican Congressman Jake Ellzey of Texas. And she started by asking for his thoughts on Trump's tariff plans.
Everything Donald Trump does and about one subject is the opening of a negotiation, and that's exactly what this is. I liken it to a bottle of Diet Coke that you throw Mentos in. It gets everybody upset, but it gets them to the table talking. So that's the opening gambit on what we're going to talk about on trade.
Okay, so that's the opening gambit. But let's say there are tariffs. Again, are you concerned it's going to hurt the economy?
Well, of course, everybody's going to be concerned about that, but the short-term hurt for America is going to be a long-term gain. That's the going-in position of the Trump administration.
In your opinion, are tariffs a good idea?
I think in the past that in this particular case, the idea of getting them to the table will lead to no tariffs and a renegotiation for our country.
So you view this as a deterrent?
Absolutely. And remember, he already did this with Colombia. He said, we're going to slap 25% on you today because you didn't take these flights of illegal immigrants. And they said, wait a minute, we'll take them now. Okay, tariffs gone. So that's the opening gambit.
But Colombia is a much different trading partner than Mexico or Canada.
Absolutely it is.
I want to move to something that it's just so difficult, is this plane crash. And you have some insight into this because you were a fighter pilot for the Navy. You flew helicopters. You were also a commercial air pilot for Southwest Airlines. I mean, first of all, you look at this and you think, how does this even happen? How does this happen?
Nighttime brings a lot of uncertainty to aircraft operations around any airport. Reagan National Airport has operated concurrently with military aircraft, specifically helicopters and B-22s, in the Washington Basin for many, many years. Something went terribly wrong. I do think that you'll see some changes coming out of this with concurrent commercial airline traffic and helicopter operations in the Washington Basin. And this is a terrible tragedy. And I will say this as a pilot, I flew 60s, the one that was involved in the mishap. Every pilot on the planet has an opinion on what happened on that tragic day, none of which are helpful to the investigation. They got both data recorders, and we'll get to, I'm sure everybody is going to be working on getting to a determination on what happened as quickly as possible. And when that determination comes back and the NTSB, which is the lead agency on this, comes out with a report, I'd be happy to come back and talk about it then.
Right after this happens, President Trump said, quote, DEI policies, quote, could have been to blame for the crash. When asked how he came to that conclusion, he added, quote, because I have common sense. He says this during a news conference that is right after the crash, the next morning, as the investigation obviously is still going on. Do you agree with that?
I think that every American in 2025 is upset that this could possibly happen in our nation's capital with such a large loss of life that doesn't make any sense to anybody. So I think he was merely showing the emotion that all of us have on an incident that is as tragic as this, and I think that's probably what's reflected there. And I'd go on to say that SecDef Hegseth did a video talking about this mishap, and I think that everybody's just upset at this point.
But upset, he's pointing to DEI. Is that the right place to point here?
I think everybody's just looking for answers.
And do you think that's an answer?
I think that he's looking for answers for why such a tragedy that hadn't occurred in the United States in 15 years could possibly happen today, possibly happen in downtown Washington, D.C., possibly happen with all loss of life on board. And that's pure emotion talking there.
You sit on the Appropriations Committee. I want to turn to the border right now because we are in a border state. Border Czar Tom Homan has said it could be $86 billion for border plans. Do you think that amount is likely? Do you think he'll get it from the committee?
Absolutely. Here's what's going on now. So we have the House, we have the Senate, and we have the White House. We're not going to put anything on the floor that Donald Trump doesn't want. So if Donald Trump wants $86 billion for border security, and Tom Homan, his closest advisor, as well as Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, says that's the number, that's going to be the number. Because we check within District 6, that's the number one issue to taxpayers in District 6 is border security, and Republican voters and most of the country, and I think the election showed that. So, yeah, we're going to do everything we can because we got to play some catch up.
Talking about mass deportations, which is part of this $86 billion, I've heard many people say that should be the criminals first. That should be the first priority. I mean, the president has said that. Tom Homan has said that. Do you think, though, after that, that people that have built their lives here, children that are born here, birthright citizenship, do you think they should be deported as well?
If they're here illegally, they've got to go back and get in line. So
you think that anybody that's here illegally should be deported?
I think that the administration has taken the tack that if they're here illegally, they can self-identify and come up with another means of getting registered. I don't know what the plan is. The administration's been in power for 2 weeks, but if you're here illegally, you're here illegally. You are breaking the law, and I think that is the tack that the Trump administration and his cabinet has taken, and that's what they are executing as the executive branch.
You can find Julie Fine's full conversation with Republican Congressman Jake Ellzey of Texas online, or, of course, as always, on the terminal, as we turn our attention back to the investigation of the fatal collision here in Washington this week. We're standing by for an NTSB briefing with the latest on this. Having spoken on the early edition of Balance of Power with a true expert here, Dr. Alan Deal, aviation safety consultant. He is a former NTSB investigator. His take on the investigation process.
The NTSB is going to be very, very careful and very meticulous about examining things like this out-of-cockpit view, voice inflections, and, of course, obviously the electronic data provided by the recorders and the radar. So this has all got to be correlated and validated before they're going to make any pronouncements.
Joining us now, Kristy Kiernan, associate professor at the College of Aviation, also associate director of the Boeing Center for Aviation and Aerospace Safety at Embry-Riddle. It's great to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, Kristy. I just wonder the questions that you think we should be asking at this stage. We are surrounded by speculation in Washington. And as these black boxes are lifted out of the water, what are the first questions you're looking to answer?
That's a great question, and thank you for having me on here. I think what needs to be discovered is we know that 2 aircraft were at the same altitude, but we don't yet know what that altitude was. We know that 2 aircraft were in the same position, but we don't know why that happened. And I think the important thing is that to understand is that we cannot stop at what. Finding out what happened will not take nearly as long as finding out why it happened. If we stop at what, we have solved nothing. We have not made any forward progress. So the first step is to extract the data from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder and the other recording devices that we have access to. Obviously, the radar tapes are important. The air traffic control audio tapes are important. And as Mr. Deal said just previously, putting all these things together to get a cohesive picture of what happened, and then more importantly, to find out why.
Well, so when we consider what that why answer may ultimately look like, whether it's determined that this was human error or if it was mechanical error, how do the fixes differ in those different scenarios, Kristy, to avoid this in the future?
Another great question. Through the process of the investigation, there will be things found that are particular to this incident that would be causal in this incident. But what the NTSB also does is they have findings of things that they may not have been causal in this particular mishap, but they are important for aviation safety in general. So there are going to be 2 streams of things. One that comes things particularly to this accident, which will result in recommendations that the NTSB makes to industry or to the FAA. And then also findings that they uncover in the course of the investigation. I also want to point out that although investigations are a very powerful tool, it is reactive. And we don't stop there in aviation safety. We're actually proactive, and we even go into being predictive. And so for a moment, I'll just tell you what proactive means. We have a safety management system that all airlines are required to have, that airports are now going to be required to have as well. That is a very data-driven process of hazard identification and risk mitigation, and then closing the loop on that to make sure that those risks are mitigated somehow. So that's where we look at, by gathering a tremendous amount of data, including anonymous reporting and incident reporting. We look at all of that, and then we are able to proactively address those hazards before they become manifest as accidents. Now we also have really amazing machine learning tools that allow us to actually be predictive and to take vast volumes of data that are transmitted every single day and that are collected from our national airspace, from every airplane flying in that airspace. And airlines look at that data, and we are able, in partnership with industry, government, and academia, we're able to then take that data and use our machine learning tools to become predictive and look even further ahead. So the results from this are absolutely critical, as the results are from any investigation, but we don't stop there. We include proactive and predictive.
Fascinating, Kristy. We understand from the Secretary of Defense that the pilot, or maybe everyone in the Black Hawk helicopter, was wearing night vision goggles at the time. Whether they were up or down is something that we're not sure about. But just by its own nature, the confusion and potential stress load that could have added to the pilot means what to you?
I've never flown on NVG, so I wouldn't really want to speak on that.
But what other questions then do you have about what took place in the chopper as opposed to the airliner?
So one really important question is what could they have seen? There are physical limits on what people can see, and I think it's really important that that is looked at, NVGs up or down. There are features of NVGs, as you know, that make the a bright environment that can be exacerbated, and there are restrictions in field of view with NVGs, right. So that's an important thing to consider. Whether the NVGs are up or down for particular crew members, how would that have limited what they're capable of seeing? And so then there's the first question is what is possible to see, and then the other question is what was actually seen. These are going to be very difficult things to parse out, and again, you know, we have a constant plea for time. I understand that people want answers quickly. So does the entire aviation safety community, but it's better to wait for a factual answer that is data-driven than it is to make a conclusion that's unfounded.
Well, that's absolutely right, and we are trying to stick with the facts here, Kristy. We also, as we consider the impatience people may be feeling, have seen the president and others frequently asked over the last several days whether or not it is still safe to fly, something that we are assured is the case. But when we consider DCA, an airport that obviously has been incredibly congested, now having reduced runway capacity as some are still closed due to the recovery efforts, the helicopter flightway essentially is now shut as well, at least for the time being. Have those actions helped make DCA specifically more secure in your mind?
That's a hard question to answer. It is a congested airspace. However, we have, as I had mentioned, the whole process of hazard identification and mitigation. There is that process involved. There are places where those margins are smaller, just like when you're driving a car, the margins are smaller on a slippery day with bad weather than they are on a clear, sunny day. So there are you know, if the congestion does play a part, then, you know, it's not an imprudent thing to do to give us a bigger safety margin right now. That is for certain true.
All right, Kristy Kiernan, Associate Professor at the College of Aviation and Associate Director of the Boeing Center for Aviation and Aerospace Safety at Embry-Riddle. Thank you so much. And we want to take you live now to the NTSB media briefing on its investigation into this midair collision. It is underway right now at DCA. Let's listen in.
This type of tragedy never occurs again. So today, I know yesterday you saw the chairman, myself, and all the board members here. I just want to let you know they are still actively involved with this. We're just trying to make sure we're dividing and conquering. The chairman and I have had multiple conversations today. She's helped out a lot in making sure we're getting the investigative needs we have. And she's at the command post right now working with some of our people. I'd like to start by just thanking the first responders. When this first happened, a unified command was set up, and we had a lot of important people that came and worked with us. In Virginia, the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department, Arlington County Fire and Rescue, Arlington County Emergency Management, Arlington Police, Alexandria City Fire, Alexandria Police, Virginia State
Todd
Police.
Inman, a member of the NTSB, again briefing the media as the investigation into the DC air crash from this week is underway.
The Virginia Senator Warner's office, MWA's Fire and Rescue Team, MWA Police. A special shout out to every one of them. MWA has been amazing in helping and working with us, and we're truly appreciative. Along with DC Fire and Rescue, just extraordinary taking the lead. Prince William Fire and Rescue. In Maryland, the Montgomery Fire and Rescue. Prince George's Fire and Rescue. Charles County Fire and Rescue. Baltimore Fire, Baltimore Police. Anne Arundel Fire Department, Maryland State Police, Maryland Natural Resource Police, MPD, DCFD, from the federal side, the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, FBI, Secret Service, Customs and Border Patrol, Park Police, DOD, Naval District Washington, American Medical Response, and yes, the U.S. Department of Labor. All of those have been amazing partners and are one of the reasons why that this investigation continues to progress the way we want it to. As I said, we did family briefings last night, and today there are over 100 family members that are now in the area receiving briefings, and as part of a legislative requirement, receiving family assistance. They have been briefed by the medical examiner, the fire chief, NTSB chairman, and myself, along with the family assistant unit from PSA Airlines. In regard to NTSB staff, all staff are now on scene that have been requested. And I want to point out one specific staff member, because we're doing a joint NTSB and DOD investigation. The NTSB actually has a Black Hawk certified pilot on staff, on our personal staff, based out of Alaska. Once we realized the dynamics and the intricacies of the Black Hawk, we have brought that member in. They are on scene now, providing direct technical assistance to the NTSB. Now, it does not mean that the DOD is not working and helping with us, but in order to maintain our independence, we have our own Black Hawk certified pilot in the working group for helicopters. Regarding salvage at this point, the Navy Supervisor of Salvage is conducting salvage operations at the current time. Barges are en route from Virginia Beach, and we anticipate them to be on scene early tomorrow morning. After their arrival, they will be secured and located, and then significant salvage operations will continue. They are ongoing right now, but this will be the main lifting. It's being done in conjunction with the DC Medical Examiner's Office in order to make sure simultaneously that any additional victims are recovered and immediately turned over to them for identification and returned to their families. SupSalv, which is the Supervisor of Salvage, is also conducting a debris mapping right now. This will help in our post-accident analysis of how the machine actually reacted to the incident. It'll also help us with understanding some of the airworthiness and crashworthiness and human factors. We have right now two distinct debris fields. One that houses the Sikorsky, which is in comparison to the CRJ, a little bit smaller. The CRJ is in another distinct area, and we consider a little bit larger. The good news is, based upon the initial mapping, while there are some small aspects of that debris field, there are large chunks that will be easily recoverable, and it will aid in the investigation when we bring it into the secured facility that will be located here on MWA. That will help us in the close proximity to be able to review and evaluate. Yesterday, we outlined for you a number of groups that have been stood up. A few of them in particular I want to call out, although every one of them have been working very hard. For your edification, the ATC group, Air Traffic Control, has been conducting interviews today. They're ongoing tonight. They will be ongoing for probably the next few days. We've had full cooperation in getting the witnesses that we need to gain those interviews. We will then take that information and match it with other data that we're receiving, and if necessary, conduct follow-up interviews at a later time.
We've been listening to NTSB member Todd Inman briefing the media on the status of the investigation into the mid-air collision that happened at DCA, Reagan National Airport, Wednesday evening between a commercial aircraft operated by American Airlines and, of course, a military helicopter. He's detailing the salvage operations that we understand will begin tomorrow as they try, through this still ongoing recovery effort, to get all of the bodies out of the Potomac River. Essentially, all 67 individuals who were on those two aircraft are, of course, presumed to have lost their lives. And as we await further detail on the investigation, noteworthy, at least in those initial remarks, Joe, we did not get any further information on cause of this crash. And investigators have said it could take 30 days for them to issue their preliminary report.
That's right. And we plan to wait for that information, as they've just now, of course, pulled the black boxes, the flight data recorder and voice recorders out of the Potomac. We heard earlier today, Kaylee, from the chief of fire and EMS here in Washington. John Donnelly has been briefing every day as well locally here. He said recovery crews have essentially run into trouble here recovering the remains of the other victims here, and the salvage company is coming into play now. As we just heard from the NTSB, this is going to be a really sensitive operation tomorrow as they bring the fuselage back above water, and I suspect they'll go to great lengths to try to obscure what's happening there. As you can see very clearly, that's right off the end of the runway at National Airport. We also learned that 2 of the runways remain closed, which could mean a lot more headaches for people coming in and out of DCA with what we all now know quite well as the busiest runway in America.
Yeah, and your point is well taken, Joe, on the sensitivity of all of this, keeping in mind that there are still dozens of families who are waiting for closure here, and we are dealing with the loss of human life at a scale, at least for an aviation disaster, that we have not experienced as a country in nearly or more than 15 years. But while this is a humanitarian issue, it also this week, we have seen here in Washington, has become political in nature as well. And so we want to bring in our closers and Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital Partner, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Jeannie, obviously there is no good time for a disaster like this to happen, for a tragedy like this to happen, but the timing is remarkable in that it was in the still early days of this Trump administration and some of the first days on the job for cabinet secretaries who have relevance here in the Defense Department and Transportation Department. When we assess their behavior this week, that of the president, how has this administration done?
You know, I think it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. I was quite heartened when Donald Trump first came out and did a moment of silence and expressed his condolences. And just looking at the pictures you were just showing, Kaylee, it is just so heartbreaking at this time of night to see the Potomac and know what these families are going through or imagine. And so I was quite heartened when he came out initially, but within about a minute, he pivoted faster than I've ever seen anybody pivot from condolences to a great deal of anger, politicizing a tragedy, you know, just a few miles, if that, down from where people's children and wives and husbands and friends and family were still in the river and their bodies had not yet been taken out. And so that was, you know, I think what made this a mixed bag. And then to have the Transportation Secretary and the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, newly minted, as you mentioned, come out, and the first thing they talked about was politicizing this as well and blaming it on DEI without having any evidence to share. And that's what I think has made this something of a mixed bag for the entire team so far.
Rick, you've spent a career working in different administrations in the White House. You worked for Senator John McCain for a lot of years and had to navigate a lot of crises moments. Not so much how is this administration doing, but the extent to which you're defined by the moments that you can't plan for. This is partly what Washington and leadership are all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we're not that far away from the tragic events around 9/11. I mean, just 8 months into the Bush administration, he had to deal with a huge, largest attack on the continental United States by a terrorist group ever, right? And nobody was ready for that. It wasn't expected. There was no girding for it. Yeah. And it defined 2 terms of his presidency, the wars that resulted from it, the security measures that born out of it. And so, yes, it is part of what defines an administration, how you react to it. What are the things that you put into place? What do you do about agencies and investigations as a result of something like this? So this is not to be diminished, but not on the scale of a 9/11 attack. Sure. But at the end of the day, you're challenged. You're going to see how your cabinet and sub-cabinet react to those challenges. You get an immediate report card on how your team is doing. And the public gets to look in and say, is this administration ready? And we'll see how, the polls turn out and how public opinion is going to take this, because at the end of the day, those are the things that I think are the tests that have to be passed.
There you have it from Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. They're going to stick with us for more of our conversation straight ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
At this point, the president has made it very clear those tariffs are going to be implemented and in effect. If the president at any time decides to roll back those tariffs, I'll leave it to him to make that decision. But starting tomorrow, those tariffs will be in place.
Has the president made up his mind about a timeline for tariffs on the EU?
No, he has not.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt on tariffs earlier today, her second round with the media, and they did confirm they'll take effect tomorrow. Mexico, Canada, 25%, China at 10%, a promise for more on everything from chips to aluminum to copper to oil. As we reassemble our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us now. Rick, he's made good on the tariff proposal. You wonder how long they hang around, though, and if this is an enticement to meet certain goals, pull them back, or the new reality for our neighbors to the north and south.
Yeah, look, I mean, he's been predicting this, so this is nothing new. We would have anticipated this all along during the course of his campaign. It's all he talked about, tariffs are the most beautiful word. Yeah. So we knew this was coming, and it's still a little early to know what it is. New reporting is out that tariffs on Canadian oil will be less than tariffs on Canadian products. And so when we see this unfold, we'll see really what the economic impact to the United States will be. On top of that, we don't know what the retaliation is going to be, but both countries have already indicated that they will retaliate. So we're seeing the very first opening gambit of a bona fide North American trade war here, and what their ultimate implications are. I would say one thing: if you've been fighting fentanyl coming into our country for some time, it's going to get a lot of attention right now, because that's the basis for what these tariffs are being applied for.
Well, so he says, Jeannie. He also says it's about making these trade relationships fairer. So what is it that's going to cause a pullback at some point? Is it actually a decreased flow of fentanyl? Do we have metrics around this? Or is it going to take it actually starting to show up at the gas pump in an economic data?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I don't think we know yet what those metrics are. Because it's Friday, Kaylee, I'm going to make a prediction. He does a splashy 25% on both tomorrow, but it doesn't get implemented for a few weeks, or maybe by that March 1st deadline that we've all been hearing about today. And that sort of ratchets up the need for both sides, or all three sides, to negotiate. And that's when I think we may see some of those markers that you're talking about. And it portends not just to fentanyl and opioids, but also illegal immigration, which he mentioned last night, and less so to the issue of trade imbalance, actually. But I do think that he's going to give some time between the splashy rollout tomorrow and the implementation, and that is going to ratchet up the need for all sides to negotiate this out. So that's my prediction, and then you can play it and see how wrong I am, Kaylee.
Oh, that never happens, Jeannie. Big VIP at the White House today. Jensen Huang, the architect of AI, sits down with Donald Trump. Rick, does this lead to either a new alliance? He was out there with a couple of AI notables, including Sam Altman last week, or additional export controls for China?
I think all of the above. I mean, Donald Trump is firmly in the corner of the oligarchs. I mean, he's in, right? He's for crypto. He's for AI. He's for more power development to fuel these, data sets. And so I think that it's almost like a meeting of the minds to figure out, what is the best strategy moving forward. I mean, they've been upset by China's developments. It's a new dynamic. I'm sure that Wang had something to say about that and sort of defend the use of his chips. But also, it's his chips that made it happen. That's true. And so, how can he work better with the government to ensure that China doesn't have access to these kinds of potential security problems for us.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel, thank you so much for joining us, helping bookend what has been another doozy of a week here in Washington. You can always find full coverage of it in the Washington Edition newsletter, and we'll see you back here next week on Bloomberg TV and Radio.